Alright, here we go. A video on zero ticks. In this zero tick video, I'll go over all the different game mechanics that make zero ticks possible, so you can make your own zero tick generators. We'll start with boring stuff, but it's necessary if you don't already know all of it. There are chapters if you want to skip forward or come back to stuff you didn't understand quite right. I put a list of game mechanics on screen that you should already understand if you want to be able to follow along. If you understand these basics, I should be able to teach you zero ticks in the next 25 minutes. If you don't, well, watch if you want, but I'm not sure you will be able to really follow along properly. So we'll start with the basics of time units. Minecraft can run stuff happening in a game every 1/20th of a second. We call that 1/20th of a second a game tick. A game tick is also a half of a repeater tick, if it can help you visualize it better. For a zero tick, we'll need to start and end a pause inside of a one game tick period. And with that, we'll be able to do some fancy stuff with pistons where we teleport blocks like this. For now, that's enough info on time units. Let's move on to pistons now. Let's start with powering a regular piston normally. Well, if we power it with a lever, it will extend for 2 game ticks, and the moving block will become solid in 3 game ticks. So we'll just say that moving blocks move for 3 game ticks, and the pistons themselves power for 2 game ticks. Now let's use sticky pistons and do the same thing. We power it with a lever, we move the block, and it looks the same. But we'll start doing more fancy stuff now. If we power the piston for 3 game ticks, then remove the power, the sticky piston can push and pull its block. Now this is the fastest that you can actually push and pull blocks. Kinda. Now let's power the piston for 2 game ticks instead of 3. An observer will do the trick. Observers give a 2 game tick pulse. The piston pushes its block, but it doesn't retract it. This is called block dropping. Block dropping is when a sticky piston is powered for a short enough amount of time that it pushes a block but doesn't pull it back afterwards. We achieve block dropping by powering a piston for 2 game ticks or less. I told you earlier that pistons extend for 2 game ticks, but their block is only solid after 3. This is what creates block dropping. The piston tries pulling too early. The block is still moving and can't be pulled at that moment. Now in game, the block doesn't look like it's moving, because it's not, but it isn't solid, so it's the same thing. Because the block isn't done moving, it can be pulled back. It's just that simple. 2 game tick pulses over. Now let's move to 1 game tick pulses before I can introduce the 0 tick ones. For 1 game tick pulses, we'll need to be creative. There's no single component that gives a 1 game tick pulse. Though, there is that torch on the redstone block thing that does a 1 game tick pulse. It's just that it takes manual inputs. We need something that can operate on its own. Although we don't have any component that gives a 1 game tick pulse, we have a few blocks that can give us a 1 game tick delay, just without any power. You're used to seeing stuff like repeaters that have their own delay and their own pulse length, because they power themselves. But there are many redstone components that we can use that only serve to propagate a signal, like doors, rails, or node blocks. And as you know, these blocks don't give any redstone signals. Instead, we use observers to detect that they went through a change. For a 1 game tick offset, we'll do this exact thing. We have tall plants like chorus and kelp that break one after the other with a 1 game tick delay. But we can't actually use that because, well, you would have to grow them every time you need to use the thing. We also have logs and leaves. When you move a log away from leaves, the leaves propagate a signal to adjacent leaves to let them know if they should decay or not. It's coded in the leaves so they decay when you cut down trees. But it also applies to player placed leaves, even if those can't decay. The signal given by the leaves can only be read by an observer. When I trigger the piston, it moves the log, and 1 game tick later, the leaves notice a change, and our observer can then notice the leaves noticing the change, and we get a signal from there. You'll see leaves used in redstone contraptions for that 1 game tick effect every now and again, but there's one better place where we can get a 1 game tick delay more easily. Scaffoldings. When you remove support from a scaffolding, it gives a signal to other scaffoldings up and sideways to let them know if they should break or not. And like leaves, the signal is going through them at a 1 game tick speed. So we'll usually try and use scaffoldings for 1 game tick offsets. They're the most compact thing we have. And yet, we were this close to greatness. It was a beautiful new component full of hope. The community loved it. But Mojang would soon backtrack on its implementation.
They screwed us over once again! They took everything away from us! They fed us just a small taste of what we're actually looking for before they could take it away and gaslight us! They claimed they listened to the community, yet where were they when we expressed our outrage? Where were they when it was time to walk the walk? Know this, Mojang. The community will remember your front. You had no right to take this away from us. You had not even an incentive to do so.
For those of you who don't get it, copper bolts used to change their state with a 1 game tick delay. Before they made it instant.
So it now has the same input delay as a note block. It's instant. But this is just counterintuitive. The reason people loved this block so much was that it wasn't consistent with existing blocks. It did things differently and in a good way. It makes absolutely zero sense to nerf this. So this means no more smaller zero-tick builds, no more simplified giant flying machines, and no more completely precise redstone timings. We have to go back to using 2 separate input lines and then offsetting them by 1 game tick. Or go back to using scaffolding and leafstone, which are very bulky and not movable.
So they added the best redstone feature that we had in a while, and then they just took it away.
Mojang's reasoning for this is to make it quote-unquote more consistent with other redstone components. But there's a difference between consistency and just having a 5th version of a block that we already have. They originally said this 1 game tick delay was intentional.
Anyway, you get the idea? Now that we have a 1 game tick delay, we need to use it to make a 1 game tick pulse. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to power a piston through a block, and 1 game tick later, we're going to move that block away and cut off the power source from powering the piston. When a solid block gets moved, it instantly becomes non-conductive, and this cuts power instantly. In the demo setup I made, we kinda have a mirror thing going on here. The 2 sides are almost the same, except that this side, with scaffolding, takes 1 game tick longer to transmit a signal. So when this side powers this block, allowing it to power this piston, it is 1 game tick ahead of the scaffolding one. So it's giving power for 1 game tick, and the next game tick, the scaffolding side will move this block away and prevent this observer from powering the piston for the other game tick it should have. And by cutting the 2 game ticks pulse after 1 game tick of delay, we're left with only a single game tick left. So 2 minus 1 is just 1. We achieved a 1 game tick pulse. You need to understand this. This will be the basis for how we do 0 ticks in a short moment. We'll need to power pistons, then move the power source away. As soon as the block giving the power or the intermediate block by which power travels moves, the power is cut short. This is how we make shorter pulses than what the components usually make. But you don't have to put the pistons you want to 0 tick right next to this. You can just use dust and easily connect your 0 tick generator to whatever pistons you want. But using dust is sinful. And when the day of judgment comes,
You will pay for it.
We're gonna get to 0 ticks very shortly, but I need to introduce 2 new concepts here. Our 2 game tick pulses introduced block dropping, and now 1 game tick pulses are introducing faster block travel. When we power a piston for 1 game tick, it completes its extension in 1 game tick instead of 2, and with that, it also drops its block 1 game tick sooner. But moving a block sooner can only be done if you use a sticky piston. Regular pistons still allow for shorter pulses just fine, but they are stuck moving blocks in 3 game ticks, no matter what. In other words, Here's a row of blocks being pushed by a regular piston and a sticky piston. The regular piston can be fired on a short pulse just like the sticky piston, but only the sticky piston will move a block faster. And I say a block because it's only the first block that will be moved faster. Every other block in the row is stuck moving for 3 game ticks. But that's not all. Since we cut the pushing animation of the piston short, that also means that the distance that the piston head travels is shorter. Normally, a piston will push you and other entities off the block you're standing on, but that's because the piston head or the block pushing you is moving the whole distance. When you shorten the pulse to 1 game tick or less, the piston and the block don't complete the full animation and don't push entities completely off the resting block. With 1 game tick pulses, it's not really useful. It'll become useful when we get to 0 ticks. But if you use an armor stand just like this, you'll be able to check for the length of a pulse. If the armor stand is pushed off its block, you have a 2 game tick pulse or more. If it budges but doesn't fall, you have a 1 game tick pulse. And if it doesn't move at all, you have a 0 tick pulse. Make sure that you use a sticky piston to test this, because like I said earlier, regular pistons push blocks for 3 game ticks, no matter their pulse length. Okay, it is finally time. We can start digging into 0 ticks. So, the idea is pretty simple. We just keep the progression we had going on, but instead of cutting the power short after 1 game tick, we'll cut it in the same game tick. Easier said than done. I have 2 setups here where we do just that. We give power to the piston we want to 0 tick, and we move the intermediate block in the same game tick. But, well, nothing's happening, right? So clearly, there's more to it. Now that we start and end power in the same game tick, we'll need to respect a few more criterias. We'll start with the most basic one. Once we do everything within 1 game tick, we need to follow a precise order. We need to power the piston we want to 0 tick, then remove the power. For that, we'll need to figure out ways to reliably control which piston fires first. Basically, all videos on 0 ticks show you this thing with the repeater and comparator. It's a good example, but it's probably one of the worst 0 tick generator to actually help you learn how to make your own 0 tick generators, because it's not flexible at all. It uses the tall tick priority, which is an order given to a couple of components. The 0 tick generator relies on repeaters having priority over comparators and observers when you send power through them. That priority is an order that we can use to make 0 ticks. Because the repeater always fires first, wiring the repeater and the comparator to fire at the same time will always trigger the repeater first. Now make the repeater point into the piston you want to 0 tick, and place the comparator or observer ahead of the piston that moves the intermediate block cutting the power, and you have a 0 tick. Inverting the repeater with the comparator or observer leaves you without any pulse going through, because you power into this block when it's already moving, so it can't give power to the piston behind it. I'd like to also add that you can do some more stuff with repeaters. If you set 2 repeaters on each side, you can control which side fires first by setting the first repeater on the line on a higher increment, and setting the second repeater on the line on that same increment. When 2 repeaters fire in the same game tick, the one that started with the higher increment fires first. That can be useful sometimes, but I'll show you better stuff that's way more flexible. If you use a straight line of redstone dust and have observers looking at it, the observer the closest to the power source will trigger first. The order is stable until the end of that straight line. Don't get it mixed up with powering stuff with the redstone dust directly, that won't work. You need the observers. If you want the opposite, you can use rails. The observers looking at the rail the furthest away will trigger first. If you power a piston, the head updates first. Add a bunch of blocks for it to move, and the blocks the furthest away move first. There's a couple more stuff you can use, but let's pick rails for our example and make a 0 tick generator out of it. Okay, so I have this line of pistons that I want to fire. I'm going to place these blocks we'll move out the way to make our 0 tick pulse. We could just use the observers themselves, but I'll add to this setup later, so we'll need these blocks. Next, we'll need the pistons moving the blocks back and forth. Now we can place the observers pointing into the blocks. Now we put the rails in front of them, and we add the observers that move the slider. I made a small mistake when building this, but it doesn't break anything. And our input. Can you spot the issue? Yeah, it doesn't matter if we move these intermediate blocks away because the pistons are still quasi-powered by the observers. I'm not gonna explain quasi-connectivity, okay? Let's move the pistons down one block and put node blocks above each of them. Okay, now we don't have any trigger at all. Can you spot why? I'm triggering the rail from the wrong side. I told you earlier, the observer is the furthest away trigger first when looking at rails. In our case, that's the piston that triggers the slider, which is bad because that means that the slider moves before these observers can power through the blocks and power the pistons. We want to reverse this order and make every observer that powers the pistons to trigger before and end with the piston of the slider. We can do that just by placing the input on the opposite side of the rails. That's gonna change where the rails start their updates and set the order the right way for our zero-tick generator. We can use other stuff than rails to achieve the same thing, like pushing a row of blocks or using a redstone wire. We might need to change the side of the input though. And if you go vertical instead, you could use bubble columns or walls to create a zero-tick pulse. It's just as easy. You take two inputs at different heights and you use the correct input to power and move the power away. So when you do zero ticks, try playing around with an update order that works like these to control which observer fires first. It's the most flexible way to create zero ticks. Now we'll go back to our previous zero tick setup we had and I'll show you another thing. Let's move our pistons behind the moving blocks instead of under them. We're going to have a 2 blocks high wall of pistons to trigger this time. So I'm placing the pistons and now I trigger it. Yet only the top pistons trigger. Do you know why? It's because of block event delay. In order to understand BED, you need to have a good understanding of block updates. I'll teach it to you. When you power a repeater, for example, the repeater does two things. It sends power and it sends updates. Without the updates, you can't let components know that they're powered. They will be stuck in their current state until they're updated, like this. You should see updates as notifications for blocks. They're usually carried with power, like the repeater, but some components that don't give power still give block updates. For zero ticks, we'll generally use rails, node blocks, bells, pistons, and moving blocks. These will be the main sources of updates found everywhere, because they update instantly, and you can chain them together easily. When you power or move these, they will update neighboring blocks. Let me show you two examples. With quasi-connectivity, you can power pistons from one block higher. If you put an observer in diagonal, the observer does have an update range big enough to update the piston when it is powered. But when I move the observer up one block, and that I point it into a solid block, it does power the piston, but it doesn't update it. But if we add an updater block like the ones I mentioned earlier, the update will follow the power change. If we use dust redirection, we can do the same thing. Redirecting a piece of dust without changing its power level will allow to power blocks, but it doesn't update them on its own. So we'll have to add wiring to add that update. Now, even though I'm showing you how to use these particular updater blocks, other blocks will still give block updates too. You could power something without giving it an instant updater and have a different wire send block updates without power, and that would achieve the same thing as this previous example. But if you keep a component butted under constant power or lack of power, like this piston, you have to watch your adjacent wiring or it could update it when it isn't time. That could cause issues. By the way, something is called butted when it just isn't in the right power state and it's waiting for a block update to change. Now, how do you know if something gives block updates? Using a block update detector. These things are buzzed just by themselves. It's a piston with a slime block and a redstone block above. When a piston receives an update, like me clicking on the node block, the piston notices that it is powered by a redstone block above it, by quasi-connectivity, and so it pushes up. When the piston is done pushing up, it updates itself and sees that it is no longer powered, and then it retracts. If you just have one piston, it resets itself. But if you have two updates in less than 3 game ticks, the piston will spit out its blocks, because the second update will let it know that it's no longer powered before it is done with a 3 game tick push, which is the minimum time for a push and pull, like I told you earlier. So when this bud pushes, it thinks that it still has power. It's only when it is done pushing that it checks its surroundings and realizes that it has no power and retracts. If you let it know that it has no power before it is done pushing, the piston will retract before the blocks are done moving, and they won't be retracted. An observer pulse, for example, would send a block update as it powers on and when it powers off. These two updates happening within 2 game ticks will update the piston to start pushing, then update it again to stop pushing. It ends up finishing its pushing animation before the moving blocks are done moving, and so it retracts without them. It's the same as the block dropping example we had at the start, even though the power wasn't steady like with an observer powering it directly. Maybe I should clarify something. Any budded component can be called a block update detector, really. I just show you the piston one because it's the simplest to use and because it resets itself. Lastly, when using buds, you should know that they have no delay. The chain updates instantly throughout the entire length. So you can bud as many components as you wish and create a big domino effect that will chain instantly. This domino effect will be the basis of block event delay. Block event delay is basically another type of instant delay. Yeah, I know. Instant delay sounds like an oxymoron, but I think it conveys the point perfectly. Block event delay is going to be the delay that stems from pistons alone. When you trigger multiple pistons in a game tick, they enter a queue. In our current setup, you can imagine that we have the top piston fire first, so they enter the queue first. We then trigger the piston that pushes the intermediary blocks to the side, which puts them second on the queue. The bottom pistons of the wall we're trying to zero tick are not in the update range of the observers, which means that they need an additional update source to trigger. They're not counted in the queue initially. They will enter the queue once they receive a block update. The pistons above them will act as this block update. I count the other pistons already in the queue because they receive block updates when they're powered, but this isn't true of the lower ones. Okay, that doesn't make any sense. They get block updates from pistons. Any piston that needs to wait for another piston to trigger before it can update can't be put on the list initially, and will need to wait for its updater piston to power before it can be scheduled in the queue. Now let's actually go through the example and see how the scheduling would work in practice. The top pistons were scheduled first. Then the slider that removes the power was scheduled in second. If these pistons are supposed to update the lower ones, they will need to trigger before they can update the lower ones and put them on the list. Except that the list has the slider going beforehand. They would enter the queue here, in third. But this puts them after we remove the power. Do you get it? They would need to power after we remove the power. It just doesn't work. This is a case where you would hear just add bed. Bed is just short for block event delay. So how do you add bed? By adding pistons, but you have to do it in a very specific way. You need to create a domino effect with budded pistons. If you put pistons where they're directly powered, they all enter the queue at the same time and they don't do anything for us. They'd behave like this set in our wall. They all power with the same priority. But if you bud them like so, they will have to create a chain where this piston can power before this one fires, and this one needs to wait for this one, and this one needs to wait for this one. It doesn't look like much, but when you introduce two chain reactions going at the same time, they will both alternate their pistons on this list. So you will be able to force a chain reaction to last longer to keep the power for longer. Every budded piston you add before it can trigger the piston that removes the power source lets you update more budded pistons on this side. If the chain reaction on the slider is longer than the one here, you should have enough bed to trigger every piston. One piston is equal to one bed basically, they're the same thing. Without enough bed, you don't power enough pistons. When you add bed, you can power more pistons not directly powered. Adding bed is only necessary when you're dealing with pistons outside of the update range, and that you don't have the possibility to update them using other instant updaters than pistons, like node blocks or rails. We can use different setups to visualize bed better. Here, I have a setup to help you understand it better. When I power this, the entire line is able to power the pistons under, but they need an update to know that. This piston is going to give that update. The update will then go from this piston to the next, to the next, to the next, until the end of the line, and trigger them in that order. So when I power this lever, This block is the first moved, whether I turn it on or off, because it's the only one directly powered, and therefore the only one that can start a domino effect. Now, if I add a redstone block under one of these pistons, it's going to be able to create a 0-tick pulse when I turn this lever off, because the first block moves, then takes time to notify the adjacent pistons that they need to start retracting. During this time, the redstone block is able to give power, which will travel and power these pistons further away. The more pistons are chained over here, the more pistons this line will be able to power. This is what creates block event delay. You need more budded pistons in this chain in order to power more pistons outside update range in this chain. Sometimes you can get away with placing a node block in here, and that will update the piston without you needing to add bed. But sometimes there is no room to add a node block, so you have to add bed. Now there's one last thing you need for 0 ticks, which most often than not comes by default without you needing to purposefully add it in. An update for retraction. Take this setup for example. It's just a smart piston. When you place a block, this torch will power through it and power this redstone dust, which will power the piston instantly. But then, the piston also pushes the block instantly, thereby turning off the redstone dust. So we do have a 0 tick here. Why doesn't it turn off? Honestly, I don't really know why. This dust is in update range of the piston, so all is telling me that it should turn off, but it doesn't. I'm no code reading rat, so I can't figure out why the dust turning off doesn't update the piston. But let's just ignore that instead of learning why, and force an additional update to turn off the piston and create that 0 tick. We already have our 0 tick pulse with that, like I told you. So we just need to add an update that we make sure happens after the piston fires. This will let it know that it's done extending and start retracting. The best way to make sure that we update the piston after it fires is by budding a component that gives block updates right next to it. Here's how it works. We know that this piston is powered by quasi-conductivity and that an adjacent update will trigger it. The piston starting to extend will provide that block update. So the QC piston will power, and that will give a block update to the smart piston, which lets it know that it's no longer powered, and that will create the 0 ticking piston effect. We can use more stuff than just pistons for an update. We just need the component to be budded and for it to give a block update instantly. You can use rails, node blocks, and bells for that. The best setup to exist is this one by LiluPolQ. It uses a self-budding rail to update the piston after it pushes. Now let's go to the last way to make 0 ticks. I showed you how to use observers first, because it's the most flexible way to create 0 tick pulses. But there's one method that is easier, and it relies only on block event delay. It looks like this, or this. The idea is very simple. You move a redstone block or an observer and make it power one piston before it can update the budded one that will push it away. It's pretty easy. You just QC power the piston and have another piston act as the update to make it power. You can power blocks very easily around this area. Note that you can replace this piston with a node block updater and it will 0 tick, but it won't give enough bed to trigger any pistons. You need a minimum of 1 piston of bed in order to 0 tick a piston with this setup. And if you struggle to power any piston like in the previous example, try adding block event delay by chaining pistons like I taught you to. This type of bed-only zero-tick generator can be used very easily with sliders powering stuff to the side, overhead, underneath, or any column. Okay, now that's everything you need to know to use and create your own zero-ticks. But that's not to say that we're done. I have to show you a few more things to consider when you use zero-ticks. We went over how a zero-tick pulse is even possible, where I explained how to shorten a pulse length to last less than a single game tick. I also taught you block dropping and faster block travel, as well as the simple armor stand trick to test for pulse lengths. After that, I showed you how to use observers or repeaters in conjunction with other components in order to make zero ticks. I then showed you what block event delay is after a quick explanation of block updates. Finally, I told you about adding updates when required before adding purely bed-based zero-tick generators. Now let's talk about practical application. Zero-ticks will be useful in very few contexts, but when they're useful, they are truly useful. Zero-ticking is basically block teleportation. You can only teleport blocks one block over at a time. But that alone is already useful. When it comes to storing items, you must have encountered box loaders. They load items in shulker boxes to compact stuff. Well, there's the basic ones, and there's the fancy ones that you can open. They're called accessible box loaders. I like these. When it comes to shulker box collection of accessible shulker box loaders, the best way to break the shulker box is often to zero-tick a composter in the box's spot. That makes the composter teleport, and as the shulker box breaks, the shulker box item is stuck in the composter. We have to use tricks like this because we can't realistically put blocks around the box to make it go to the right place. After zero-tick shulker box collection, there's instant piston extenders. These show up all the time in advanced piston doors and tree farms. Having multiple zero-tick generators is already a challenge, but then you also have to remember one of the core things about zero-ticks. It only affects the first block moved by a piston. So when it comes to zero-ticking piston extenders, you can't just have something like this. You will need folding piston extenders. The idea is super simple. Since you can't zero-tick multiple blocks at a time, you just chain multiple blocks, but one at a time. Oh, did I tell you? Piston heads are only solid when they push, so when we zero-tick, the piston heads are completely ignorable. We can push blocks into them and create an instant piston extender. One other tricky part with zero-ticking piston extenders is that as you add pistons, you progressively need more bed. Here's an old nether tree farm core I was making before Mojang decided to f me over. The first piston only needs 2 pistons total. But the second piston needs that many. If I don't have that many, the pistons inside the core won't zero-tick. So this is the added block event delay that you need to worry about if you do zero-ticking piston extenders. This is all the zero-tick info I could give you. It took me quite a while to make this video. If you appreciate these types of videos teaching you different techs, you can support me for free by liking, hyping, and sharing the video to someone who might find it helpful. You can also support me monetarily since today through YouTube directly, but TMC is free. No special treats if you give me money. As always, the TMC Resources Archive can help you, and you can contribute to it. Link is in the video description. Thanks for watching. I'll see you later.